You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Throughout the latter part of the 1700s, Louisiana, a major part of France's overseas empire, became entangled in European political scheming. Aside from Louisiana, France's empire included just a few small outposts along key rivers like the Mississippi. In a secret move in 1762, through the Treaty of Fontainebleau, France handed Louisiana over to Spain. After France lost the 7 Years' War, Spain ended up controlling the lands west of the Mississippi River, while the British took over the territories east of it. With the birth of the United States, Americans managed the territories east of the Mississippi River and just north of New Orleans. A top priority for these new Americans was ensuring they had free passage along the Mississippi River to the open sea. As American settlers spread over these lands, folks like Jefferson believed that the U.S. would gradually acquire more territory bit by bit. However, there was a looming concern that a weakened Spain might lose the territory to another power, leading to a serious reevaluation of this gradual approach. New Orleans had become a crucial hub for moving agricultural products to and from the American lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1795, thanks to Pinckney's treaty with Spain, American traders were granted the right of deposit in New Orleans, allowing them to store goods there for export and solidifying their right to navigate the entire Mississippi River, critical for the expanding trade in the western lands. But in 1798, Spain withdrew this trading privilege, frustrating many Americans. In a positive turn of events in 1801, Spanish Governor Don Juan Manuel de Salcedo reinstated the American right to deposit goods, taking over from the Marquis of Casacalvo. However, the previous year, Spain had secretly agreed to give Louisiana back to France in Napoleon's Third Treaty of San Ildefonso. This agreement was officially recognized in the 1801 Treaty of Aranjuez, framing Spain's handover of Louisiana to France as a restoration of territory, not a return. Louisiana nominally stayed under Spanish control until November 30, 1803, when it was finally transferred to French control. This change was short-lived, as just 3 weeks later, on December 20, 1803, France formally handed Louisiana over to the United States. Back in 1800, a treaty passed between Spain and France didn't catch much attention, but a year later, when Napoleon sent troops to Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti, it caused quite a stir in America. People were worried this might be the first step in a French invasion. President Jefferson tried to calm things down, but his opponents saw it as a chance to push for actions against France. To counter, Jefferson even floated the idea of teaming up with Britain, despite the two countries not being on the best of terms. Jefferson backed France's plan to regain control of Saint-Domingue, which had become autonomous under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture after a slave uprising. However, there was a growing fear in the U.S. that Napoleon would go after New Orleans next. To prevent that, Jefferson tasked Livingston with the mission to buy New Orleans in 1801. In January 1802, Napoleon sent his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, to take back Saint-Domingue. Louverture, who had managed to keep other European powers at bay while gaining more control on the island, was taken prisoner. Napoleon was keen on getting back the profit the colony used to generate, but Jefferson decided the U.S. would stay neutral, indirectly supporting the rebels to keep France from establishing a presence in North America. Come 1803, Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, living in the U.S. and a close associate of Jefferson, started informal talks with France. He suggested buying a bigger chunk of land than planned to avoid conflict with Napoleon over North America, which led to the idea of the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson was well informed about Napoleon's military moves thanks to having inside information. He even sent James Monroe to Paris to negotiate, ready to pivot to Britain if necessary. Napoleon, needing peace with Britain to take full control of Louisiana, and seeing it as indefensible without it, decided to sell when a war with Britain seemed inevitable. Despite some internal opposition, Napoleon told his finance minister he was thinking of selling Louisiana to the U.S. in April 1803. Before Monroe had even arrived, France offered the entire territory for $15 million. U.S. representatives were shocked but jumped at the chance, worried Napoleon might change his mind. The deal, known as the Louisiana Purchase, was signed on April 30, 1803, and it practically doubled the size of the United States. After failing to regain Saint-Domingue, where most of the French troops succumbed to disease and resistance, France pulled out in November 1803. Haiti declared independence in 1804, becoming the second republic in the Western Hemisphere. However, Jefferson and Congress, fearing a similar uprising in the U.S., refused to recognize Haiti and imposed a trade embargo, which, along with France's hefty demands for compensation, left Haiti struggling economically for years. After Monroe and Livingston returned from France with news about purchasing a significant area of land, the United States officially announced this deal on July 4, 1803. This left President Jefferson and his team until October to figure out if this purchase was even allowed by the U.S. Constitution. Initially, Jefferson considered adding something to the Constitution to make the purchase permissible, but his advisors persuaded him otherwise. In defending the deal, Jefferson argued it was akin to a guardian acquiring land for a young person under their care, believing it was for the good of the United States and therefore within the constitutional provisions. Historian Henry Adams and others have noted that Jefferson, who typically insisted on strict adherence to the Constitution, relaxed the rules to facilitate the Louisiana Purchase. There were many, especially among the Federalists, who disapproved of the purchase. They criticized its cost, questioned France's ownership, and argued it contradicted Jefferson's principles. Some even contended that the land rightfully belonged to Spain, though evidence did not support this assertion. Critics also expressed concerns about the potential for new states from this territory to shift political and economic power away from the states along the Atlantic coast, and the possibility that it could lead to the expansion of slavery. Some individuals in New England even discussed founding their own country due to these apprehensions. For the most part, those opposing the deal were worried about losing financial and political influence to the new Western territories. Regarding the territory's previous proprietors, Spain was displeased with the sale, arguing France had pledged not to sell the land and lacked the authority to do so. However, the United States highlighted that Spain had already ceded the territory, rendering these objections invalid. Despite the controversy, Jefferson proceeded, bolstered by assurances from his team that the deal was constitutional. The Senate swiftly ratified the treaty, and the House arranged for the financing, borrowing $15 million from foreign banks. The United States took control of the vast territory, initiating expeditions to explore it, including the renowned journey by Lewis and Clark. On the 20th of December, 1803, a significant event took place at the Cabildo in New Orleans. France handed over the historic city to the United States, marking the occasion with a flag-raising ceremony at what is now known as Jackson Square. This transfer happened just 3 weeks after Spanish officials had completed the formalities of passing the colonial lands and their governance back to France on the 30th of November, 1803. Then on the 9th and 10th of March, 1804, a notable ceremony called Three Flags Day was held in St. Louis. This event was to officially transfer ownership of Upper Louisiana first from Spain to France and then from France to the United States. Following this, from the 10th of March until the 30th of September 1804, Upper Louisiana was managed as a military district. The man in charge was Amos Stoddard, who was named the first civil commandant by the War Department. Starting on the 1st of October 1804, the newly acquired land was organized into 2 parts: the Territory of Orleans, which would largely become the state of Louisiana, and the District of Louisiana. Initially, the District of Louisiana was under the temporary control of the Indiana Territory's governor and judicial system. However, by the next year it was renamed the Territory of Louisiana. Throughout this time, New Orleans served as the administrative hub for the Orleans Territory, while St. Louis took on the role of capital for the Louisiana Territory. To cover the cost of the land, the U.S. government came up with a payment plan that included issuing sovereign bonds and taking over certain French debts. Back in early 1803, after Byrd, Savage, and Byrd collapsed, Francis Baring and Company, based in London, stepped in as the U.S. government's go-to bank in London. Because of their prime spot, they were asked to handle this big purchase, working closely with their buddies at Hope and Company in Amsterdam. These 2 banking giants teamed up, combining Hope's knack for dealing with sovereign bonds and Baring's strong ties to America. In April 1803, Francis Baring's son Alexander, alongside Pierre Labouchere from Hope and Company, headed to Paris to help hammer out the deal. Their banking expertise was key in getting the French and Americans to agree on dropping the price from 100 million francs to a more manageable 80 million francs, which would be about $15 million back then, or roughly $371 million today. They also figured out the exchange rate, setting it just right for the deal to work. Part of the arrangement had the U.S. picking up the tab for up to 20 million francs, or $3.75 million, of French debts. The rest, 60 million francs, $11.25 million, would be covered by U.S. government bonds that had a 6% interest rate and were due to be cashed out between 1819 and 1822. As of October 1803, the U.S. Treasury had $5.86 million ready to go, planning to use $2 million of that to pay off some of the French debts included in the purchase. Napoleon was eager to pocket his cash as soon as possible, so Baring and Hope agreed to buy the bonds for 52 million francs, kicking things off with a 6 million franc down payment and following up with 23 monthly installments of 2 million francs. The first set of bonds was rolled out on January 16, 1804, even though the banks had already forwarded a 10 million franc advance to France in July 1803. Desperate for the funds, Napoleon pushed for a speedy wrap-up, leading the banks to send over an additional 40.35 million francs by April 1804, fully settling their dues to France. In the end, Baring and Hope snagged the $11.25 million in bonds for a cool $9.44 million. The U.S. Treasury settled the last of this debt in 1823. In total, with interest, the Louisiana Purchase bonds cost $23,313,567.73. Although the War of the Third Coalition had kicked off, pitting France against the UK before this deal was sealed, the British government initially let it slide, figuring it was better for the neutral U.S. to own this chunk of land rather than their French adversaries. But by December 1803, the British ordered Baring to stop any more payments to France. Baring passed the word to Hope, which decided to ignore the directive, ensuring the final payments were made to France by April 1804. Not long after the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory, a disagreement erupted with Spain regarding the actual size of Louisiana. The issue stemmed from the fact that none of the prior agreements, such as when France handed Louisiana over to Spain, later regained it and then sold it to the U.S., specified the territory's boundaries clearly. The United States believed Louisiana should encompass all the land draining into the Mississippi River on the west, extending all the way to the Rocky Mountains, and even including the Rio Grande and West Florida. Spain, however, contended that Louisiana was merely the land on the western side of the Mississippi, along with New Orleans and St. Louis. This confusion was eventually resolved in 1819, with the Adams-Onis Treaty, where the U.S. secured most of the western lands it desired. Originally, the region known as Louisiana was a narrow strip administered from Cuba, while a vast tract of land to the west was under Spanish sovereignty and not considered part of the internal Louisiana territories. Envisioning Louisiana to stretch over to include lands draining into the Mississippi from the west also implicated land extending up to what was British territory at the time, reaching as far as what we currently refer to as Canada. Moreover, the eastern boundary of Louisiana was intended to be the Mississippi River flowing south to a certain demarcation, but the exact starting point of the river was uncertain. Below a specific line known as the 31st parallel, the delineation became even more complicated. The U.S. claimed territory extending to another river, the Perdido, whereas Spain insisted everything up to the Mississippi was theirs. This was conclusively clarified when the Adams-Onis Treaty defined the borders, establishing today's boundaries, including that the 31st parallel is the demarcation for the western part of the Florida Panhandle, and the Perdido River marks Florida's western boundary. Due to the uncertainty surrounding Louisiana's western edge, President Jefferson undertook the task of dispatching explorers to thoroughly map the area. This led to the renowned Lewis and Clark expedition heading up the Missouri River, another team exploring the Red River. Then there was Pike's team, which initially set out up the Missouri but ended up exploring the Arkansas River area. Additionally, the duo Dunbar and Hunter surveyed the Ouachita River. Their extensive efforts in mapping and exploration greatly contributed to the definitive drawing of the Adams-Onis Treaty's western boundary, with precise directions that traversed rivers, meridians, and parallels. Managing the Louisiana Territory proved much harder than acquiring it. The area was home to a diverse population, including people of French, Spanish, and Mexican descent who were mostly Catholic. There was also a significant number of enslaved Africans, as Spain hadn't stopped the transatlantic slave trade. This mix was especially noticeable in what is now Louisiana, which also had many free people of color. In areas that would become Arkansas and Missouri, there were already slaveholders by the late 18th and early 19th centuries. During this time, South Louisiana saw an influx of French-speaking refugees escaping the massive slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti. Among these refugees were planters who brought slaves with them. Many slaveholders in the South were worried this new land might encourage slaves in America to revolt, similar to those in Saint-Domingue. They pushed for the United States government to allow slavery in the new territories so they could move their agricultural ventures there, hoping also to lessen the chance of slave uprisings. For administrative ease, the Louisiana Territory was divided into smaller sections. These areas passed laws about slavery that mirrored those in the southern United States, although they also kept some rules from the French and Spanish, like Spain's 1769 ban on enslaving Native Americans. Despite this, some individuals of mixed African Native American descent were still enslaved in St. Louis, Upper Louisiana, when the U.S. took over. The slavery of Native Americans continued until a court case reached the U.S. Supreme Court and ended it in 1836. The firm establishment of slavery in the territory by U.S. law would later contribute to the outbreak of the American Civil War. As states formed within the territory, the question of whether they would allow slavery became a divisive issue in Congress, with the South advocating for slave states and the North against. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 was a temporary fix to this growing conflict. After initially exploring the area, the United States government decided it was time to take control of the region, mainly because British and French traders from Canada, along with their Native American allies like the Sauk and Fox, were still dominating trade along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. To get in on the action in 1804, the U.S. converted a former Spanish facility at Fort Bellefontaine, near St. Louis, into a fur trading post to do business with the Sauk and Fox tribes. By 1808, the U.S. had set up two military forts that also served as trading posts: Fort Osage along the Missouri River in what is now western Missouri, and Fort Madison along the upper Mississippi River in today's eastern Iowa. As tensions with Great Britain heated up, Fort Bellefontaine was turned into a military fort in 1809 and served as such until 1826. During the War of 1812, the British, with help from their Native American allies, handed defeats to the U.S. forces in the upper Mississippi region, forcing the U.S. to abandon Forts Osage and Madison, along with several other forts built during the conflict like Fort Johnson and Fort Shelby. The Treaty of Ghent, ratified in February 1815, eventually secured U.S. ownership over the entirety of the Louisiana Purchase area. Following the war, the U.S. beefed up its presence along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, upgrading Fort Bellefontaine and building or expanding several other forts, including Fort Armstrong and Fort Edwards in Illinois, Fort Crawford in Wisconsin, Fort Snelling in Minnesota, and Fort Atkinson in Nebraska, all between 1816 and 1819. The Louisiana Purchase was a significant event where the United States acquired a vast tract of land from France, but they did not consult the Native American tribes who actually resided there about their views. For the 40 years following this acquisition, the government required many Native American tribes to vacate their homes east of the Mississippi River and relocate to new areas, culminating in the event known as the Trail of Tears. This entire scenario ignited extensive debates over whether the indigenous people possessed any rights to their land. During the 1930s, there were numerous legal disputes where tribes sought compensation for the land commandeered from them due to the Louisiana Purchase. This ultimately led to the creation of the Indian Claims Commission Act in 1946. A pivotal figure in this development was Felix S. Cohen, a lawyer for the Interior Department. He is well quoted for stating, "Practically all of the real estate acquired by the United States since 1776 was purchased not from Napoleon or any other emperor or czar, but from its original Indian owners." Fast forward to today, it has been determined that all the treaties and payments the U.S. has made for that land up until 2012 have amounted to about $2.6 billion. That's equivalent to $11.2 billion in today's currency, which reveals that the original $15 million paid to France was merely a tiny fraction, about 3.5%, of the total sum expended to secure the land from both France and the Native American tribes. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.